Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our sound for video session. Great to have you all here today on a, it's not quite winter, but almost winter. It feels like winter here. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you got a chance to work on some of your sound projects throughout this last week. And let's jump into our agenda and take a look at what we're going to cover here today. So just first, I want to kind of take a step back, and we've talked about compression a bunch of times, but I think it's worth taking kind of a different look at it. This time we'll do just a quick review of sound, what sound is, what amplitude is. We'll kind of review very quickly some of the settings you'll typically see in a compressor and what its purpose is, typically for spoken word audio in particular. And then we'll talk about or demonstrate how to set a compressor by ear as opposed to relying on visual tools and cues and things of that nature. So that'll be the main thing that we'll focus on today. And then we'll go to our chat here and see what questions we have out there today. So with that, let me just do a quick run through here on what sound is. And I want to just show a little video here over on the Mac really quickly. So I have this video here. What is represented here? This, let's say over on the left-hand side, this gray bar here is essentially a speaker cone. It's the part of the speaker that vibrates back and forth. And then here we have our air particle or air molecules. And then this is kind of a visualization of what or how sound is produced and what happens. So you have these what are called condensations when the speaker cone moves forward and the air gets compressed, it goes to higher pressure. And then there's a rarefaction when the speaker cone moves back. So here's a condensation where it's higher pressure, and here's a rarefaction where it's lower pressure. And that, of course, is all produced here by this moving speaker cone. So sound is energy moving through the molecules of the air, and it creates these waves. Now, it's very distinct from wind. Wind is different. Wind is actually taking a whole ton of particles or molecules, of air and moving them from, say, one city to another. Very different here. You can think of as sound as a little bit more like vibrations. So it's vibrating all of those molecules in the air, and they're moving like demonstrated here. Again, here's a little look at that. Okay, so that's just, again, a quick reminder of what that is again. And to hear the different pitches of sound, of course, it has to do with how quickly that wave moves up and down within a given period of time. So within a single second, if a wave moves up 100 times, up and down 100 times, it will sound something like this. Okay, so that's a low frequency sound. If we have a higher frequency sound, now Danny asked me to warn everybody, this can be a pretty grating sound that I'm going to play next, so be prepared on your volume or your headphones or speakers. This is a 12 kilohertz tone. It looks like just a block if you look at it here, but if we zoom way in, you can see, in fact, it is a waveform. But this is going up and down 12,000 times per second, and it sounds like this. Okay, I don't want to do that one too long. That can be a little bit like fingernails on a chalkboard out of context. So, and so that's how different pitches are, how we perceive different pitches is based on how quickly those waves go up and down, moving the molecules of air. Now there's also amplitude, and amplitude is in essence how we perceive loudness. But it's a little bit more complex than that, but it's generally loudness. So if it's represented here as this kind of waveform, if I zoom in here, amplitude is the distance from the middle line here, the 0, out to the top and out to the bottom. So you could think of these as maybe our condensations and rarefactions here. But the closer up to the top or to the bottom it gets, generally the louder we perceive it. So that's what amplitude is. And that brings us to the concept of a compressor. Now let me clarify one thing really quickly. If we have a transient, let's go ahead and let's go back here. This is the video that we posted. This is the audio from the video that we posted on our other YouTube channel just this morning. This is a clap right here. And it happens very, very quickly. You can see like the waveform goes up and down very, very quickly. It's almost at zero. So this should be about the loudest you could possibly experience. But the reality is because it happens so quickly, it definitely sounds like a loud click, but it doesn't generally strike us as especially loud unless it sustains high amplitude over time. So that's one distinction that's important to make. It's just a psychological thing, and it has to do with the physics of and just the way our hearing works, the way our eardrums pick it up, and the way our brains actually interpret the information that our ears are sending via the nerves to the brain. So there's a lot going on there. But the idea with a compressor is that I want to be able to do a few things here, even things out. So a lot of times when we talk, some people more than others, but when we talk, we tend to be maybe in many cases, louder at the start of a sentence, and then we get quieter and quieter and quieter as we go on. And then it can be a little bit hard to hear as you get quieter. But then when you start a new sentence, you might really emphasize something and get louder again. And so one purpose of a compressor from a spoken word audio perspective is to even things out a little bit, to make it easier for the audience who's listening to be able to hear everything without having to jump for their volume dial and keep cranking it up and then back down when you get louder again and back up when you're getting quieter and so on and so forth. That's one thing. Another reason that a compressor can be really helpful is to make the overall audio sound louder. So here, for example, if we measure how loud this is right now, I'm just going to do a quick scan here. We're in Adobe Audition. This is currently sitting at minus 32 LUFS. That's pretty quiet. To put that in context, in the European part of the world, the broadcast television standard for loudness is it should come in at about minus 24 LUFS. In the United States, it should come in at minus 23 LKFS, basically the same thing as LUFS. So this is pretty quiet. This is substantially quieter than that. But the problem is if I just go and boost this up, the problem is a lot of those transients start getting clipped. They end up at zero, and those they'll play back in a distorted fashion. It will sound really, really unpleasant. So I can't just crank it up. But if I do, well, let's see, if I crank it up, what does that get us to? That gets us to minus 25. I still need to get a little bit louder. That got us to minus 23. So, but look what happened. Look at all that clipping that occurred. Now, there's actually a nuance here that I didn't explain. The measurement is actually stereo. In this case, we're using a mono file to demonstrate this. So yes, I know for those that are very particular, that wasn't the perfect example, but nevertheless, the idea is that with compression, I want to be able to manage some of these transients, maybe push them down a little bit so that when I boost the overall levels, I won't have all that clipping and I'll be able to achieve my loudness target. That's another purpose of compression. And in fact, on live streams, I think it's especially important to be able to apply some sort of compression so that the listening experience is great for your audience, and you can provide it at a reasonable loudness level. And typically what we aim for here is about minus 23 on this live stream. So, all right, so those are kind of the purposes. Now, compression could be used for more than that too. In music especially, it's used to really, really sculpt the sound, but even in spoken word, it can be used to give somebody's voice a little bit more weight, a little bit more warmth, and things like that. So there's some elements of compression that are more than just kind of the practical being able to loudness normalize. That's part of it, but also being able to sculpt the sound a little bit when you really figure out how to use a compressor really, really well. So those are some of the different things that you can do. And that's why I want to talk about compression today, because I think when I've taught compression in the past, and in fact, let's just pull up here. Let's pull up a compressor. And I'm not, am I going to play? Yeah, I'm going to play this back to you. And I'm going to kind of tune in the compressor here. And we're going to have all sorts of visual feedback. We're going to see how much it's compressing. Actually, you know what? Let me mute the sound so you don't hear it. I'm just going to set it visually and show you why that's a problem. Why setting it purely visually is a problem. So we're going to come back over to our mixer, and I'm going to mute the computer sound, come back over here to Audition, and let me go ahead and, as I'm playing back, I'm going to adjust the compressor. So here we go. Okay, I'll stop it there. So let's just take those settings and let's apply them. Oh, good news. The claps I can get rid of here, I can just pull those down. Whoops. Those are just the sync claps for the video, so I don't need those. But look, I got everything managed. I don't have those huge spikes sticking out anymore. And what I can do here is let's do a scan again. We're currently sitting at minus 35. And if this was stereo, let's go ahead and convert it to stereo. I'd be aiming for minus 23. So that means, actually, let's do another measurement. So right now, we're going to be at minus 33, roughly, right? Okay, minus 32. So I need to boost it by about 9 dB to get about to where I want to be for my loudness target. Let's boost that. There we go. Measure it again. Now where are we at? We're at minus 23.32. Brilliant. Our true peak is at minus 3.5. So we've got plenty of headroom there. We're not going to clip, even after compressing it and exporting it as a lossy format in the video. Let's listen to it now and see how it sounds. Let me go back to the mixer and we'll unmute the computer, which is right here. And then we'll come back on over. Let's play a little bit of that. Both the focals, my regular mixing monitors, and also the JBL 104 BTs. And what we found is that they weren't substantially different. Now, yes, I can definitely hear a difference. And yes, there's definitely closer to your listening position, your ears. That's how we found they actually sounded the best. We got the most out of them. Okay. It's actually not the worst I've heard, but that's also not the sweetest sound that I've heard either. And let me just kind of go back. Let's undo Command Z, Command Z, Command Z, Command Z. And let's pop that compressor back in here again. So I'm going to come down here. And the type of compressor, I mean, you can use any compressor. This one just has lots of visual feedback, which is why I showed it. So we could tweak things around. So let's go like a really fast release and a fast attack. We really want to take these and pull them down fast. Let's just play that a little bit and see how that sounds while I'm out and about. So I think that's really kind of the bottom line. I wanted to try and put that into a perspective that makes sense. Obviously, in a review, we can't just play them back and you can, it doesn't really work all that well for you to hear them through another mic and then process through YouTube. But hopefully that gives some perspective on what these will do for you. They have an integrated power amp, so there's 30 watts per speaker. So again, you can, with the, there's some of my mistakes in my recording, but nevertheless, you heard an example of what it sounds like when it's really, really overcompressed and what it, again, not a great sound. So let's go on over to our slides again, and let's just talk about a couple of things here. So first of all, what is amplitude? Again, we mentioned that what amplitude is, it has to do with how tall those waveforms are, how close, in digital audio at least, how close they get to 0 dB. Okay, so that's amplitude, and that's what we're generally trying to manage when we're working with a compressor, or at least at a practical level, that's what we're changing. We're changing the amplitude of the tallest amplitude parts of the waveform when we're using a compressor. And just to do that, there are several compressor settings that you'll almost always see. So there is the threshold. So the threshold is basically you choose a level dB full scale when you're working with a digital compressor. And essentially what you're saying is for the compressor, don't do anything until the amplitude of the audio gets louder than or goes above this threshold. That's the point at which the compressor starts to work. Okay? And then the attack refers to how quickly it starts to work once it passes that threshold. And the release is how quickly it lets go. It stops compressing after the audio amplitude comes back down below the threshold. All right. And then the ratio, actually, I need to slow down. So let's do a review there. Threshold is basically where you tell the compressor to start kicking in. And when the amplitude exceeds that threshold, then the compressor will start. The attack is how quickly it starts to apply its compression, and release is how quickly it lets go and stops compressing after the audio goes back down below the threshold. Okay, and then ratio is how much it compresses the audio that does go above the threshold. So for example, if I have my compressor set to a 4:1 compression ratio, and the amplitude goes 4 dB above that threshold, in essence, what'll happen is it will actually take those 4 dB and compress them down to just 1 dB above the threshold. So that's one way to think about it in practical terms. So the ratio is like how much compression it does. Attack is how quickly it starts to compress once the audio exceeds that threshold, and release is how quickly it lets go of the compressing once the audio amplitude goes back down below the threshold. So with that, let's pause there. Are there any questions in the chat that we need to take a look at? Let's go ahead and pop those up and take a look at those.
There's an unrelated question. Do you want to come back to that?
Yeah, let's come back to the unrelated questions.
But here's a few comments.
Okay, a few comments. Jake, I always talk about compression on vocals as bringing the quiet parts up. Peaks will always be controlled with gain. So really we're talking about the valleys in the waveform, lowering dynamic range. I think that's a good way to think about it. Definitely lowering dynamic range. You want to make it easier so that at a given volume setting for your audience, they'll be able to understand everything. That's the important thing. The reality is with the human voice, there can be a lot of dynamic range. So much so, in fact, that if you were to set the gain on your recording so that the loudest parts, say you have an opera singer, so that the loudest parts are not going to clip when you're doing a digital recording, then the quiet parts are going to be so quiet that very few people can hear them. If they go into a whisper, it's going to be really hard for them to hear, the audience to hear the whisper. So that's a great way, Jake, to think of it, is that we're going to manage the highest amplitude things initially, at least. We're going to handle the highest amplitude things by setting our gain, and then we are going to use that compression to pull that down, and then we can use makeup gain to bring it all back up. Once we've compressed it and leveled it out so that it's a little bit more even and you don't have these big transients sticking out, then you can boost the overall level with makeup gain, which is another thing you'll typically see in most compressors, so that the loudest parts and the quieter parts are closer. There's less dynamic range, and yet it's all loud and loud enough for everybody to hear everything. So that's a great way to put it. Thanks for that, Jake. Audio Buff, tonight is our church's Christmas musical. I'll be using 42 mics. Our sound system will be moving a lot of air. Yes, and again, it's not like wind, but it'll be vibrating a lot of air, if you want to think of it in those terms. I'm excited for you, Audio Buff. That'll be fun. And I wish you all the best on that. Cool. Christopher, I forget, do you normally have compression dialed in on your Shelford channel for your live stream? Yes. In fact, you're hearing some compression right now. My voice is being compressed right now. And that's in fact why when I whisper, you can probably hear that just fine. But also when I get a little bit louder, it's managing that at the same time. So yes. Okay, cool. All right, let's go back and let's go and review these settings here really quickly. Threshold is where you can move the threshold up or down in terms of dB, full scale. Starting at 0, you can move it down, and anytime the audio amplitude exceeds that threshold, the compressor starts doing its work. The attack is how quickly it starts doing it. The release is how quickly it lets go of the compression once the amplitude goes back down below the threshold. And the ratio is how much compression it does. When it does go above the threshold, when the audio does go above the threshold, the waveform, how much does it squash it down? Say, for example, a 1-to-1 ratio, it does none. It doesn't do any compression. If you go to a 2-to-1 ratio, then for every 2 dB that go above the threshold, it's going to squash that down to 1 dB. So that's a mild amount of compression. If you go 8-to-1, a ratio of 8-to-1, every 8 dB that goes over the threshold will be squashed down to 1. That's quite a bit more compression. In fact, you're starting to get into the territory of a limiter at that point. And usually most limiters are somewhere in the 12 minus, or somewhere in the 12-to-1 to 20-to-1 to even a brick wall limiter. Sometimes you'll hear that term. Sometimes that's an infinity-to-1 ratio. So brick wall limiter will let literally nothing through. It just stops the audio amplitude right there, wherever you set that threshold. So those are the different types of ways We typically control a compressor or a limiter, which, by the way, are kind of just the same thing with at two different extremes. Like a compressor is going to be much milder. A limiter is basically just a really much more extreme compressor. So, all right, so those are the settings. So let's do something. Let's actually get rid of all the visual clues. Well, actually, let's go back to the Mac again here really quickly. And on the Mac here, so this compressor has plenty of visual cues. Let me show you. So I'm going to go ahead and play this back. That's really kind of the bottom line. I wanted to try and put that into a perspective that makes sense. Obviously, in a review, we can't just play them back and you can, it doesn't really work all that well for you to hear them through another mic and then So we have these visual cues here. We have the gain reduction here. We have, you can see where the threshold is set right here. We have this set with a soft knee. That's another concept that we're not going to really cover a whole lot today, but when this is basically the threshold here. So when the audio amplitude exceeds this, that's when this compressor started in. This red line was showing how much it was compressing for each of those. We have our ratio here set 3:1 right now. Let's go ahead and increase that. Let's give a really extreme example here. Process through YouTube, but hopefully that gives some perspective on what these will do for you. We use SonarWorks Sound ID reference kit to measure the output of both the focals, my regular mixing monitors, and also the JBL 104 BTs. And what we found is that they weren't substantially different. Now, yes, I can definitely hear a difference, and yes, there. How's that sound to everybody? Danny just gave me 2 thumbs down on that one. Awful sound, over-compressed by far, really not transparent at all. Definitely affecting the overall sound of the spoken word. So I think typically let me just give you some kind of starting points. There's no magic numbers I can give you that will work in every single circumstance. But I would say that for most dialogue, a ratio of 2 to maybe 4:1 is a pretty good place to start in most cases if you're trying to manage transients a little bit. Threshold is going to change on every single recording. There is absolutely no magic number there. And for me, that's where really using your ears and listening to hear when it's doing things is really important. Again, the attack has to do with what you're trying to accomplish. Now, with music, a lot of times, for example, with maybe if you're recording a drum, maybe let's say a snare drum, you might want to let the attack of that snare drum through the compressor. You might not want to compress that too much. You want that crack. But you might want to compress the tail of the sound of the snare drum being hit. And that's where you might move, for example, to a slower attack time. But for dialogue, it can start to, we're gonna listen and hear how the attack changes the sound in just a minute here when we have Danny start reading some Sherlock Holmes for us. And we're going to go and try adjusting the compressor settings. Release is an interesting one too. With spoken word, you heard when we moved this release really fast, it started to have, and when we kind of adjusted some of the other settings as well, it started to have this sort of pumping sound to it. Let me play that again and listen for that pumping sound. It's almost like the voice is going, ooh, 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 ooh. You can really hear the compressor working. Let's do that again. Start right here. Much lighter weight. That's because all of the electronics and the power amp are in the main speaker. 30 watts per channel, as I said, tiny footprint overall. And they have what's, I think, really interesting is their coaxial design. So here's a trick. Okay, I think you can hear that. That was what Danny gave us the 2 thumbs down on. So those are some of the things that you can see there. Now, this one also has makeup gain is something you'll hear a lot. You can do it manually. Well, actually, this one is, you can do that manually here. I don't want to get into too much into the details here. This is wet gain versus dry gain, but wet gain is the processed signal, what the compressor has done, and you can just boost that up however much you choose to. Or there's also this auto gain setting. It'll automatically basically try to keep it at the same overall loudness. And so it's going to apply after you've done your compression and you've brought some of those peaks down. Overall, your audio levels will get a little bit quieter, and the auto gain will help boost that back up to where it was. So in essence, what you're using the compressor for in that case is just like what Jake was talking about, where you're reducing the dynamic range in essence. So, all right, let's switch on over to our other camera.
I want to address a couple questions.
Oh yeah, we have some questions. Let's pop out to the questions here and see what we've got going on.
Okay, this is 2 parts.
2 parts. Homesick Mac. I've started using compression in my live streams. Learning. What are your precise compression settings for this live stream, Curtis? Well, I'm glad you asked, and I cannot tell you exactly, but what I can tell you is that on the Shelford Channel, I have there is no separate attack and release setting. There is a general speed setting. So in the Shelford Channel, which is an analog piece of audio gear, there are settings. These are your speed settings, and this applies to both the attack and the release. And they're kind of basically like hard-coded numbers, and I'd have to look up at the manual to see exactly what they are. But you have a choice of fast, medium, slow, slow, and auto. I have it set to medium. I'm using a 3-to-1 compression ratio, and I have the threshold set. Remember, this is on a different scale than digital audio. So digital audio is usually on a dB full scale, dBFS. This is an analog piece of gear, so it's a different scale. It's using a dBu scale, and it is set to -2. Sometimes I push that up a little bit, closer to 0, but that's where it's at right now. So let's so my point actually of this lesson, Homesick Mac, is that I think it's really important. Instead of I understand the reason for asking for settings. That's a good place to start, and then you can tune it in for your particular voice and your particular mic and how much gain you have applied and so on and so forth. So that's why I give you some kind of general guidelines. But I would say this: threshold, you have to set the threshold based on your own voice and how things sound. That's where you have to use your ears a lot. Ratio, I think, again, for spoken word, typically between 2-to-1 to 4-to-1 is probably generally where you want to be, assuming, like I'm assuming here, that you're trying to do compression that's fairly transparent. You're trying to make it so that it's not super obvious and it doesn't sound fatiguing for your audience to listen to, unlike that example I gave just a moment ago here. Attack, I usually set relatively fast for spoken word, again, because I'm mainly, in this particular case, if I'm just trying to reduce dynamic range, I go fairly fast on the attack. And then on the release, I go somewhere between, the fastest I would ever go on the release, typically at least for my voice, is about 150 milliseconds. Usually I move it closer to 250, maybe 300 milliseconds. If you go farther out, the nice thing about a fast attack and a slow release is generally it doesn't sound like it's been super compressed. The problem is if you make that release too slow, then every time there's a breath in between words, it's going to compress that as well, because it still hasn't let go of the compression yet. It's still doing the compression even when you take a breath. So there's where kind of the art and listening is really, really, really important. And that's going to differ based on a person's cadence, how quickly they speak. So that's why, typically I say there are no hard and fast settings that I can just give everybody that they can set once. And there are a ton of video people. Can't tell you how many video editors are like, just tell me the settings. And then they put it in as a default on all of their video timelines, and they forget about it, and they never talk about it again, and they never look at it again. And the problem is that when they get different voices in there, or even the same voice on a different day, and maybe the gain setting got changed a little bit during the recording, those settings don't apply anymore. They may actually be more destructive, more damaging than helpful. And so that's why it's really important to just spend a little time practicing. It's not all of you can do it. Every single one of you can hear well enough to do this effectively. And we will demonstrate that in just a minute. So that's a fantastic question, Homesick Mac. I'm so glad you asked it. Darren says, is compression always applied at the beginning of your signal chain?
Vocal signal chain.
Yeah, if it's a vocal, and specifically in the case of vocals, not necessarily. A lot of times I may have an EQ before it. I might do another round of EQ after. EQ can be used for a lot of different things too, just like a compressor we were talking earlier. EQ can be used for fixing problems. For example, resonances, that is a combination of somebody's voice and a particular microphone, or perhaps in a particular room. So EQ can be used to perhaps solve and reduce some of those resonances before compression. And then you might use another round of compression another round of EQ after the compressor in some cases to sweeten the audio even more. So, and to kind of sculpt the sound a little bit more. So it depends, Darren, to answer your question. But typically I'll do the repair EQ before the compression, and then the sweetening EQ after the compression is usually how I think about it. Mark. To clarify ratio, example 4:1 is for every 4 dB reduced by 1 dB, so that 12 dB over threshold is reduced 3 dB? Yes. I think the math is about right there. So yeah, it's about right.
I think
Danny's taking a look through the chat here. So yes, Mark. I think you're spot on there. Another question from Drew. Should I apply compression in the UAD Apollo or in the A10 Mini Pro? Drew, you could do it either place. Either one is perfectly valid. Where I would do it is in the Universal Audio Apollo, personally, because I think the compressors there are... that would just be my personal preference. You could do it either place, but I think the choice of compressors in the Apollo are really pretty fun, and they sound great, and they tend to be fairly transparent, again, if you get them set right. In fact, we're going to use an analog compressor here in just a minute to illustrate our point of using your ears as opposed to trying to just look at the waveforms and use the visual cues. So I would go to the Apollo, but either way can work.
Okay, one more.
Maybe a question for later from Thomas. Do you have different guidelines for setting with a lookahead compressor or any new things to look out for? So the question is specifically about lookahead. Good question. There's some other considerations there. I don't know that we'll probably get to that today, Thomas, but that's a good question. I think I'd like to come back and address that at some point as well. So a lookahead compressor is in essence usually something that can look ahead in the digital file and see what's coming and kind of prepare for that. So anyway, we will come back to that at some point.
We have a couple of others that we'll come back to later.
Okay, a couple other questions that we'll save for the Q&A a little later on. So with this, let's go ahead and switch on over to the other camera here. And we are going to take a look at this. This is an analog compressor here. And we're going to have Danny. Danny's microphone is connected to this, and she'll be, again, reading some Sherlock Holmes. But before we do that, I want to just kind of run through some of the settings here. Now, this one's a little different, you'll notice. So here, for example, let me just drop this is the ratio setting here. If I set it to 1:1, here's a quiz. How much compression is it going to do? Danny answers 0 compression. It's not going to do any compression, and she's right. And you might ask, well, why do you even have a 1:1 ratio setting if it's not going to do any compression? And the answer is a kind of a nuance for this particular unit itself. This is an analog piece of gear with vacuum tubes for some of the electronics, some transformers, so that the compressor itself actually colors the sound to some extent as the sound moves through it. So that is a weird kind of situation here where it actually imparts some color just going through the compressor, even if it's not doing any compression. There's also a bypass setting, so we can just turn the compressor off altogether if we wanted to do that. Now, here's a tack, and you can see it's very vague. It's fast all the way to the right and slow all the way to the left. It's not telling you how fast. It's not telling you the number of microseconds or milliseconds. Same with the release. It's fast all the way to the right and it's slow all the way to the left. Again, no indication about what that means. This is a classic analog compressor. This is how they did it. And I think there's some advantages to it too, because it really forces you to use your ear to understand what's going on as opposed to relying on a number. We then have, our ratio. We already talked about that. But then we have no threshold and we have this input and output instead. So what gives? What does that mean? Well, you'll see here actually on the unit itself, it calls this an 1176 limiting amplifier. And so what's interesting about this is that when, instead of a threshold that you adjust directly, what you do is you increase the input level to boost the overall level so that the amplitude will run into that threshold. Okay, so it's a little bit different way of thinking about it. I'm going to turn the output for now down to 0. So that's how you change the ratio in essence, is you push the levels of the audio up as they go into the compressor so that they will bump up against that threshold at some point. And that threshold, to be honest, actually changes to some extent when you change the ratio here. That's the kind of non-linearity you're experiencing with this kind of compressor. So let's go ahead and have Danny start reading. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself just so that we're not picking up a lot of room noise. And we're going to have Danny read a paragraph. Let's do one paragraph. And so you can hear what it sounds like with no compression. So here we go.
I will tell you then what occurred in your house last night. Your niece, when you had, as she thought, gone to your room. Do you have my mic on? Because I'm not hearing myself. Okay. Your niece, when you had, as she thought, gone to your room, slipped down and talked to her lover through the window which leads into the stable lane. His footmarks had pressed right through the snow, so long had he stood there. She told him of the coronet. His wicked lust for gold kindled at the news, and he bent her to his will. I have no doubt that she loved you, but there are women in whom the love of a lover extinguishes all other loves, and I think that she must have been one. She had hardly listened to his instructions when she saw you coming downstairs, on which she closed the window rapidly and told you about one of the servants' escapades with her wooden-legged lover, which was all perfectly true. Your boy Arthur went to bed after his interview with you, but he slept badly on account of his uneasiness about his club debts.
Okay, so that's where we're starting. I had to adjust some things here since we're not applying any compression yet so that you could hear it really well. And since we're bypassing the compressor, it wasn't doing this additional amplification here, so I had to boost the levels a little bit over here on the preamplifier. Okay, so that's where we're starting from. And it's actually not bad. The reality, though, is if Danny decided to do a really dramatic performance, there would be some really loud parts that might be at risk of clipping, so we'd have to turn the gain down. And then when she got to the delicate whispering bits, then you may not be able to hear her. Say, for example, if you're listening back in your car to the audiobook of The Barrel Coronet by Sherlock Holmes as presented and performed by Danny. So that's what we're trying to address to some extent here. So what I want to do next is I want to just kind of start with the settings. Let's just kind of go to the, think of these maybe as Unity settings, kind of the default settings there. I'm going to be playing with that a little bit. I'm just going to turn the ratio to 4:1. Okay, and I'm going to probably need to start with the input and the output right around there. And just watch what I do to change the settings. And while I'm doing that, listen to how it changes Danny's voice. That's what we're looking to do here. Okay, so I'm going to just do our first round here, and let's go with that. So with that, I'm going to mute myself, and then Danny's going to read.
Do you want me to pick up where I left off?
Yeah, we're going to have you pick up where you left off.
Okay. In the middle of the night, he heard a soft tread pass his door, so he rose, and looking out, was surprised to see his cousin walking very stealthily along the passage until she disappeared into your dressing room. Petrified with astonishment, the lad slipped on some clothes and waited there in the dark to see what would come of this strange affair. Presently she emerged from the room again, and in the light of the passage lamp your son saw that she carried the precious coronet in her hands. She passed down the stairs, and he, thrilling with horror, ran along and slipped behind the curtain near your door, whence he could see what passed in the hall beneath. He saw her stealthily open the window, hand out the coronet to someone in the gloom, and then closing it once more, hurry back to her room, passing quite close to where he stood hid behind the curtain. As long as she was on the scene, he could not take any action without a horrible exposure of the woman whom he loved. But the instant that she was gone, he realized how crushing a misfortune this would be for you, and how all-important it was to set it right. He rushed down just as he was, in his bare feet, opened the window, sprang out into the snow, and ran down the lane where he could see a dark figure in the moonlight. Sir George Burnwell tried to get away, but Arthur caught him, and there was a struggle between them, your lad tugging at one side of the coronet and his opponent at the other. In the scuffle, your son struck Sir George and cut him over the eye. Then something suddenly snapped, and your son, finding that he had the coronet in his hands, rushed back, closed the window, ascended to your room, and had just observed that the coronet had been twisted in the struggle and was endeavoring to straighten it when you appeared upon the scene.
Okay. Thanks, Danny. Good dramatic performance, by the way.
Thank you.
Very much appreciate that. Okay, so let me just kind of debrief a little bit on what we changed there. You'll notice when we first started, it sounded very obviously compressed in a really unpleasant sort of way. So what was going on there? I have to remember where the settings were. I believe that the attack was slow or medium. The release was medium. The input was fairly high. And the output was about medium there too. By the way, this meter that we have right now is set to GR, which means gain reduction. So what it's showing us is how much gain reduction the compressor is doing during its work here. So that was where things sounded really kind of weird. So what was happening is that when Danny would start to get louder, it was taking a while before it would start to kick in. And it was taking a medium amount of time to let go once it dropped back down below the threshold. But this compression, this is the equivalent. You can think of this as the ratio in this case. The input level, we were pushing it way too hard and it was compressing. In fact, if we have Danny go and do that again, watch the needle and you will notice it's almost entirely pegged against the left, meaning it's doing massive amounts of compression.
Continue on. All right. "Is it possible?" gasped the banker. You then roused his anger by calling him names at a moment when he felt that he had deserved your warmest thanks. He could not explain the true state of affairs without betraying one who certainly deserved little enough consideration at his hands. He took the more chivalrous view, however, and preserved her secret. "And that was why she shrieked and fainted when she saw the coronet," cried Mr. Holder. "Oh, my God, what a blind fool I have been! And his asking to be allowed to go out for 5 minutes. The dear fellow wanted to see if the missing piece were at the scene of the struggle. How cruelly I have misjudged him!" "When I arrived at the house," continued Holmes, "I at once went very carefully round it to observe if there were any traces in the snow which might help me. I knew that none had fallen since the evening before, and also that there had been a strong frost to preserve impressions."
Okay. So there you can see what's happening. Now, what's interesting on like a vintage compressor like this, in some respects, the input level does the amplification. So you don't really need, well, actually, I guess the output is more like the makeup gain. You can think of the output as the same as makeup gain, and you can think of the input roughly. It's not exactly the same, but roughly like the threshold setting. So those are the differences we're seeing here. And you can see with Danny's voice, we were able to get to a fairly, we were able to reduce the dynamic range enough so that it was fairly even with the dramatic performance. By the way, you're doing a very good job on that. So thanks for that. But we were able to manage some of those transients, the bigger peaks, the taller peaks. And we were able to, we brought it in fairly quickly here and then had a release. It was kind of medium-ish. And we brought this input level down quite a bit just so that we weren't we weren't compressing every last thing. I also experimented a little bit with the release time here. Again, if you leave the release time too long, the breaths can become much more prominent, especially with, if you're using a compressor live where you don't have an opportunity to go back in and attenuate any of the breaths. So the release, you kind of have to dial that in a little bit more. So we ended up somewhere around a little faster than the mid setting. And again, the idea here is, and the beauty of using something where you don't have all the numbers, these numbers are kind of just arbitrary, I think. the nice thing about having the numbers is you have to rely on your ears. So there's some definite benefits to that. Okay, let's take a pause and let's go to the chat and see what questions we have out in the chat. Here, we'll go back to the main camera. Okay, Danny's going to scour through things there. Let's see what we've got. Okay, from Jake. I love the sound of the 12-to-1 ratio on the 1176. Well, we can try that. Shall we? Shall we give that a go? Let's switch back over to the compressor. This is an 1176 compressor from Universal Audio. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and Danny's going to keep on reading.
I passed along the tradesman's path, but found it all trampled down and indistinguishable. Just beyond it, however, at the far side of the kitchen door, a woman had stood and talked with a man whose round impressions on one side showed that he had a wooden leg. I could even tell that they had been disturbed, for the woman had run back swiftly to the door, as was shown by the deep toe and light heel marks, while wooden leg had waited a while and then gone away. I thought at the time that this might be the maid and her sweetheart of whom you had already spoken to me, and inquiry showed it was so. I passed round the garden without seeing anything more than random tracks, which I took to be the police. But when I got into the stable lane, a very long and complex story was written in the snow in front of me. There was a double line of tracks of a booted man, and a second double line which I saw with delight belonged to a man with naked feet. I was at once convinced from what you had told me that the latter was your son. The first had walked both ways, but the other had run swiftly, and as his tread was marked in places over the depression of the boot, it was obvious that he had passed after the other.
Okay. Thanks for that, Danny. So that one, you can hear when we did hit transients there, it was compressing them a fair bit more. So when you get up into that 12-to-1, you're really treating this a little bit more like a limiter. Again, there's a kind of a fuzzy line between the two, but that's what we were hearing there. So thanks for that, Jake. Okay, we'll go back to our main camera here, and we'll take a look at the chat and see what else we've got out there. Drew, thank you so much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Thanks so much. All right, Glenn, are you using just balanced cable or a cloudlifter? Let me just describe. I'll describe my audio chain and Danny's. So Danny is on a Shure KSM8 dynamic microphone. So that's one of the newer dynamic microphones produced by Shure. That's coming into the Universal Audio 6176, which is a channel strip. It has both a preamplifier in it and it has the compressor in it. And there is no cloud lifter. That's going, the output, the line output of that is going into the Canon C200 camera. That's where it gets converted into digital and kind of lined up with the video. And then that goes into the A10 Mini. And then that is connected to my computer and streaming out over OBS to YouTube. So that's Danny's signal chain. My signal chain is this Earthworks Ethos microphone, which is right here. And then that's going into the Rupert Neve Designs Shelford Channel. No cloud lifter, nothing like that. So that's also a preamplifier, an EQ, and a compressor. And then that goes line out into the Canon C200 and the same signal chain from there. So that's exactly what you're hearing today, Glenn. And yes, just a balanced. Adds a lot of sibilance.
A bit.
Adds a bit of sibilance. Yes. Yes, that's another thing to watch for. When you're doing compression, you can change the sibilance. So you want to listen for that as well. We'll come back to that in just a moment here. You can actually emphasize sibilance, so it can be something you want to watch for. And in fact, that's one of the things that the tubes, so the tube compressors, instead of using transistors, it uses vacuum tubes, the old school tubes that we used before there was such a thing as transistors. This uses that, and those impart some harmonics and some other coloration. It also has some transformers in it for isolation, and the transformers also impose a little bit of color. So there are definitely some things. It's changing the timbre of the voice a bit as well. That's That's a reason like a lot of musicians get really excited about all this analog gear. Spend a lot of time playing with it because you can really sculpt the sound. Mark says, I think there is confusion regarding by and to. For 4:1 compression, every 4 dB over the threshold, a gain would be reduced by 3 dB down to 1 dB passing over the threshold. Okay, thank you, great Mark. Appreciate that. And confusion regarding by and to.
I think what it would be reduced to.
Okay.
And the ratio by which it's reduced to.
Oh, yes, it's reduced by, okay, I follow what you're saying now. It's reduced by 3 dB down to 1 dB passing over the threshold. Thank you very much for the clarification. Completely follow you now. Yes, I completely agree. Can the attack be too fast on voice? Will that make it too punchy? Yes, absolutely, it can. And we should experiment with that as well. Let's do that as well and listen to what that does to Danny's voice. We'll go ahead and switch back over to the compressor.
Okay.
Oh, wait.
I think yes, you agreed with this, but he just clarified.
Okay, yes, and thank you, Mark, again. So in Mark Holloway's example, 12 dB over the threshold at a 4:1 compression ratio would be reduced down to 3 dB and not reduced by 3 dB. Correct.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so now let's switch on over to the other camera here. And we can take that chat off the screen. Thank you again, Mark. All right, and I'll mute myself and Danny will continue on.
I followed them up and found they led to the hall window where Boots had worn all the snow away while waiting. Then I walked to the other end, which was 100 yards or more down the lane. I saw where Boots had faced round, where the snow was cut up as though there had been a struggle, and finally where a few drops of blood had fallen to show me that I was not mistaken. Boots had then run down the lane, and another little smudge of blood showed that it was he who had been hurt. When he came to the high road at the other end, I found that the pavement had been cleared, so there was an end to that clue. On entering the house, however, I examined, as you remember, the sill and the framework of the hall window with my lens, and I could at once see that someone had passed out. I could distinguish the outline of an instep where the wet foot had been placed in coming in. I was then beginning to be able to form an opinion as to what had happened. A man had waited outside the window. Someone had brought the gems. The deed had been overseen by your son. He had pursued the thief, had struggled with him. They had each tugged at the coronet, their united strength causing injuries which neither alone could have effected. He had returned with the prize, but had left a fragment in the grasp of his opponent.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was a really great way to describe it, is that when you do use that really fast attack, it will sound punchier. Definitely have a punchier sound to it as opposed to a more mellow and transparent sound to it. So yes, that's another reason why it's really, I think, important to adjust that attack and use your ears to figure out what you would do here. In our case, with Danny's voice, I probably would go somewhere here into the mids if I wanted a mellower sound. If I wanted it to be a punchier sound, a little bit more in your face, then you would go with a faster attack. But you can adjust that to some extent there. But that's where using your ears as opposed to just using some settings that somebody told you, that some guy on the internet told you, like even Curtis Judd told you to use whatever. Use your ears to find what sounds the best and accomplishes what you need it to accomplish. Okay, cool. Let's go back out to the chat and see what we've got going here today. Hi, Curtis. The Focusrite Scarlett Solo works on the Chromebook. I'm so glad to hear it. I'm glad that that's working well for you. And also thank you so much for the super chat. And happy recording. Get out there and make some great sound. I'm excited for you. I remember my first audio interface. I was so excited. I got a Roland. I don't even remember the model number. They don't make it anymore. It was a pretty good little audio interface, just a USB 2-channel. Anyway, it's really good. Linda says, I like this 12:1 setting through my laptop speakers. Very good. Again, that's one of the things that you can really sculpt the sound. It's amazing how much it changes the person's voice. And Linda also notes that it sounded breathier with the fast attack. Interesting. Yes.
We have people asking for your opinion on something, but I need to go back to like the very beginning.
Okay, Danny's going back to the start because we had some questions early on. So we're going to go take a look at those. First up from Camille. Question, what picture profile LUTs do you use for client work and YouTube videos? I don't use LUTs. I don't even usually film in log profiles. Sometimes I do, but even when I do, I typically will grade those individually. So I don't use a LUT typically. So there's the short version. Picture profiles, usually on the Canon, I'm filming. So here's a C200. This is just straight out of the camera, Rec 709. Nothing special beyond that. I think for me, it's more about the lighting and getting things dialed in as far as exposure and creating the lighting design that I want. So I don't usually use any sort of picture profile. It's just Rec 709, just standard. On the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, and actually that, by the way, that applies not only to Canon C200, but for our regular videos not regular videos, our videos on the main channel, I usually use the Canon C70, and that's also usually set to Rec 709. So I don't actually use LUTs generally. Daniel says, I know that on voice, a fast release can cut off the end of words, but what would a too fast attack do to a voice? It's less noticeable when I play with it. Does it make the voice too punchy? And I think the answer to that is based on what I was just hearing on Danny's voice. Yeah, it does make that. It gives it a little bit more of an in-your-face sound. So it didn't sound quite as transparent is how I would probably term it. But yes, I think that definitely, get a recording and start playing with a compressor. You can really you'll start to hear the nuances. It's a lot of fun, actually. Matt Ruff says, off topic, did you see the new Sound Devices A20 Nexus 8-channel digital wireless receiver? Looks really great, really expensive as well. I did see it. I don't have a need for it, so I'm not planning to buy it, but it looks really neat. I mean, it's so small, 8 channels, really small. I can get up to 8 channels right now on the SL2 if I had all the receivers to support it. I have 2 A10 receivers that are actually currently getting upgraded to A20 hardware, by the way. I sent those into Sound Devices to get those upgraded to the new version, and that'll give me 4 channels of wireless, which is usually plenty for me. But yeah, for those that need a lot higher channel counts, that A20 Nexus looks really neat.
And you had 2 other people asking you what you thought of that.
What I think of it, I think it's fantastic. Yay. Yay for the people that need lots of wireless channels. It looks like a fantastic device. I would love to play with it. Maybe I'll get a chance to do that. But yeah, it looks fantastic. What I'm waiting for next, what I'd love to see from Sound Devices, I have no insider information about what they're working on or not working on, is I would love to see a new A20 transmitter, like the regular size A20s, or like the A10 transmitters, but an A20 version that has a wider tuning range and all of the new features, the gain forward and all of that. That's what I'd love to see next. The writing on the wall seems to suggest that's probably going to happen too. Darren, nice demo of applying compression. Thanks for the info. Have a good work week. Thank you so much, Darren, and I wish the same to you, that you have a fantastic week and that you're able to make some great sound. Thanks for the super chat.
I think there's a couple of other things.
Christopher, C200 has a balanced XLR in. How would you rate its converters? Yes, it does have 2 XLR inputs, and I would say that for a camera, its converters are actually surprisingly decent. Yeah, that's exactly what you've been hearing on the live stream here for, I can't remember how long now, at least 8 or 9, maybe 12 months, maybe longer. We got the C200 right around this, just before the pandemic started, so I think we got it at the start of 2020 or maybe the very end of 2019, and then it kind of became the main live stream camera not too long after that, so it's actually probably been closer to 2 years. But yeah, not bad. Good enough for a live stream is what I would say.
This is not a question but an interesting comment.
I don't like the sound of the ATEM compressor. It's too squashy. The limiters are great in the ATEM, just not the compressor. Thanks for that, Jake. That's I think there's going to be some nuance there. They're digital, and they're not going to have the coloration that the analog type compressors have. They're not going to have the sweetness necessarily that you're going to find on the analog compressors.
Okay. And also,
Derek, thank you so much for the super chat. Yeah, Danny has a question. Do you want your mic on? Let's turn your mic on. No.
Do you have pre-submitted questions?
No. Danny asked if we had any pre-submitted questions, and we did not have any this week. So we're good there. It's time, isn't it?
It is time.
We were just getting started. I was having so much fun that I lost track of time. I hope that this was helpful for all of you. Thank you so much for those of you that were able to join us today. And I hope that you're able to get out there and make some great sound and use a compressor in a very delicate way. For spoken word audio, I think it's really important to use your ears to dial in that sound exactly where you want it and where it sounds the best. So fairly transparent is usually the strategy I'm going for. And hopefully this was helpful in kind of getting you started on that journey if you haven't already headed out on that journey already. So with that, get out there, make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.